The morning of October 12, 2001, dawned crisp and clear over the small town of Cedar Falls, Montana. Autumn had painted the surrounding mountains in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and there was an electric anticipation in the air at Cedar Falls Elementary School. 26 fourth-grade students, ages 9 and 10, had been looking forward to this day for weeks. Today was their annual field trip to the abandoned Copper Ridge Mine, a local historical site nestled deep in the Bitterroot Mountains, 43 miles from town. Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne, a beloved teacher with 22 years of experience, had organized this excursion as the culmination of their unit on Montana's mining history. At 51, she was known throughout the school district for her passionate dedication to bringing history alive for her students. She had made this same trip 17 times before, always returning with students buzzing with excitement about the underground tunnels, the rusted mining equipment, and the stories of the brave men who had carved their livelihood from the mountain's depths. The yellow school bus, driven by veteran driver Frank Morrison, arrived at the school at precisely 8:30 a.m. Morrison, 62, had been transporting children safely through Montana's mountainous terrain for over 3 decades. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel with the confidence of someone who knew every curve, every pothole, every hidden danger along the winding mountain roads. Parents later recalled how he had smiled and waved as their children climbed aboard, his usual reassuring presence making even the most nervous mothers feel at ease. Among the students settling into their seats was 10-year-old Emma Caldwell, a bright-eyed girl with auburn braids who had been chattering about the trip for days. Her best friend, 9-year-old Jessica Torres, bounced beside her, clutching a disposable camera her father had given her to document their adventure. In the back of the bus, brothers Tommy and Daniel Winters, twins with matching mischievous grins, were already plotting which artifacts they hoped to find in the mine's depths. Near the front sat quiet Rebecca Lou, a thoughtful girl who had checked out every book about mining from the school library in preparation for the trip. Beside her, class clown Michael O'Brien was already entertaining his seatmate with impressions of their strict principal, Miss Patterson, earning giggles from nearby students. The energy was infectious, filling the bus with the kind of innocent excitement that only children possess when embarking on an adventure. Mrs. Hawthorne conducted her final head count as the bus doors closed. 26 students, all present and accounted for. She had made copies of permission slips, medical information, and emergency contacts for each child. Everything was meticulously organized, as it always was. The substitute teacher, Miss Amanda Foster, 24 and fresh out of college, had volunteered to assist with the trip. This would be her first time visiting the mine, and she was almost as excited as the children. The route to Copper Ridge Mine was well established, taking them north on Highway 93 for 30 miles before turning onto Forest Service Road 402, a narrow but well-maintained gravel road that wound its way through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The final 13 miles were the most challenging, with switchbacks that climbed steadily toward the 7,200-foot elevation where the mine entrance waited like a dark mouth in the mountainside. Morrison guided the bus through Cedar Falls Main Street, past the post office where elderly residents waved from their morning coffee gathering, past the volunteer fire department where Chief Raymond Walsh watched the bus pass and made a mental note of the time. This detail would later prove crucial to investigators trying to piece together the timeline of what would become one of Montana's most baffling mysteries. The first 25 miles of the journey proceeded without incident. Students sang songs, played word games, and pressed their faces against windows to spot wildlife in the forest. Miss Hawthorne moved through the aisles, sharing stories about the mine's history, painting vivid pictures of the copper boom that had briefly made the area prosperous in the early 90s. She told them about the immigrant families who had made their homes in the mountains, the dangers the miners faced, and the ghost town that had been left behind when the copper played out. At approximately 9:25 a.m., Morrison made the turn onto Forest Service Road 402. The bus began its serpentine climb into the mountains, the engine working harder as the altitude increased. Students giggled when their ears popped, and Miss Hawthorne distributed pieces of gum to help with the pressure change. The last cell phone tower was now far behind them. Even in 2001, coverage in the remote Bitterroot Mountains was non-existent. It was Rebecca Lou who first noticed the black pickup truck. As the bus rounded a hairpin turn at mile marker 8 on the forest road, she glimpsed it through the rear window, a dark-colored pickup, maintaining a consistent distance behind them. At first, she thought nothing of it. These mountain roads saw regular traffic from hunters, loggers, and Forest Service personnel. But as the minutes passed and the truck continued to follow at the same measured pace, never getting closer, never falling further behind, a vague uneasiness began to settle in her chest. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Rebecca said quietly, raising her hand. "There's a truck that's been following us." The teacher looked back through the rear window, squinting against the morning sun. The black pickup was there, perhaps 200 yards behind, moving at exactly their speed. Mrs. Hawthorne felt a slight chill, but pushed it aside. It was hunting season, after all. The truck was probably just heading to the same general area. "It's fine, sweetheart," Mrs. Hawthorne assured Rebecca with a smile. "Lots of people use these roads." But privately, she found herself glancing back more frequently. The truck never varied its distance, never attempted to pass despite the occasional wider sections of road that would have allowed it. There was something deliberate about its presence that made her increasingly uncomfortable. At 9:52 a.m., the bus reached mile marker 12 on Forest Service Road 402. They were now only 1 mile from the mine entrance, winding through a particularly dense section of forest, where the towering pines blocked out much of the sky, creating a natural tunnel of green shadows. It was here that Frank Morrison noticed the tree. A massive lodgepole pine, easily 80 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter, lay across the road ahead. It appeared to have fallen recently. The break showed fresh white wood, and the pine needles were still green. Morrison began to apply the brakes, bringing the bus to a gradual stop about 50 feet from the obstruction. "What's wrong, Mr. Morrison?" Mrs. Hawthorne called from the front passenger seat. "Trees down," Morrison replied, setting the parking brake and turning on the hazard lights. "Looks like it just happened. I will take a look." The veteran driver stepped out of the bus, his boots crunching on the gravel road. The morning air was thin and sharp at this altitude, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. As he approached the fallen tree, Morrison examined the brake. Something about it troubled him, though he couldn't immediately identify what. The wood looked too clean, too uniform, as if it had been cut rather than naturally broken. Behind him, the students pressed against the windows, their excitement undimmed by the delay. To them, this was just another part of the adventure. Tommy Winters called out through an open window. "Is it a really big tree, Mr. Morrison?" "Big enough," Morrison replied, kneeling to examine the base of the trunk. That's when he saw them, the fresh saw marks, barely visible but unmistakably artificial. This tree hadn't fallen naturally. It had been cut down deliberately and placed across the road. A cold knot formed in Morrison's stomach as he straightened up, his eyes scanning the dense forest on either side of the road. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant chatter of children inside the bus, and the soft whisper of wind through the pine boughs. No birds sang, no small animals rustled in the underbrush. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Morrison turned back toward the bus, intending to radio for help, using the school district's emergency radio system. But as he walked, he became aware of another sound, the low rumble of an approaching engine. The black pickup truck that Rebecca had noticed was drawing closer, its engine note changing as it downshifted for the steep grade. The truck stopped approximately 100 yards behind the bus, close enough that Morrison could see it clearly, but far enough away that he couldn't make out the driver's face through the windshield. The engine continued to idle, but no one got out. The driver simply sat there, waiting. Morrison's unease escalated genuine alarm. In 30 years of driving these mountain roads, He had developed an instinct for danger, and every fiber of his being was now screaming that something was terribly wrong. He quickened his pace toward the bus, his hand reaching for the radio microphone clipped to his belt. Inside the bus, Mrs. Hawthorne had noticed the pickup truck's approach and the change in Morrison's body language. She had taught long enough to recognize fear when she saw it, and Frank Morrison was definitely afraid. She moved to the front of the bus, her hand instinctively reaching for the cell phone in her purse, before remembering that they were far beyond any cell tower's reach. "Children," she said in her calmest teacher voice, "I need everyone to sit down quietly for a moment." The students, sensing the shift in atmosphere, complied with unusual speed. The cheerful chatter died away, replaced by an expectant silence. Even the class clown seemed to understand that something had changed. Morrison reached the bus and quickly climbed aboard, his face pale and his breathing shallow. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "we need to get out of here, now." "What's wrong?" Mrs. Hawthorne whispered. "That tree was cut down on purpose. And that truck." Morrison glanced toward the rear of the bus. "Something's not right." Mrs. Hawthorne felt her blood turn to ice. "Can we turn around?" Morrison shook his head. "Road's too narrow here. We'd have to back up almost a quarter-mile to find a place wide enough." He looked at the fallen tree blocking their path forward, and that truck's got us boxed in behind. It was then that Emma Caldwell, the girl with auburn braids, pointed toward the forest and said in a small, frightened voice, "Mrs. Hawthorne, there are men in the trees." Every eye on the bus turned to follow Emma's gaze. At first, there was nothing to see but the dense wall of pine and shadow. Then, like figures materializing from a nightmare, dark shapes began to emerge from behind the massive tree trunks. Men in camouflage clothing, their faces obscured by masks or face paint, moving with the silent precision of hunters. Mrs. Hawthorne's training kicked in. In situations of danger, protect the children above all else. "Everyone get down," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of 22 years of classroom management. "Get on the floor between the seats. Now." The students obeyed instantly, their young faces showing confusion and growing fear. Jessica Torres clutched her disposable camera, her knuckles white. The Winters twins huddled together, their earlier mischief forgotten. Rebecca Lou, the observant girl who had first noticed the truck, squeezed her eyes shut, as if she could make the threatening figures disappear. Morrison's hand moved to the radio, but before he could key the microphone, a sharp crack echoed through the forest. The bus's front windshield spiderwebbed as a bullet punched through the glass. The shot clearly intended as a warning rather than an attempt to harm. Morrison dove for the floor, pulling Mrs. Hawthorne down with him. "Don't try the radio," a voice called from the forest. The words carried clearly in the thin mountain air, spoken by someone accustomed to command. "Step out of the bus. All of you. Hands where we can see them." Mrs. Hawthorne's mind raced. They were trapped on a remote mountain road, miles from help, with no means of communication. The men in the forest were clearly organized and prepared. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a carefully planned ambush. But what did they want? Ransom? The children? The thought of her students being harmed sent a wave of maternal fury through her fear. "Stay down," she whispered to Morrison. "Keep the children calm." To the voice in the forest, she called out, "We are just teachers and children on a school field trip. We don't have anything valuable." A harsh laugh echoed from among the trees. "You have exactly what we need, lady. Now step out or we start putting holes in that bus with your kids inside." Morrison met Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes. In 30 years of driving, he had faced ice storms, mechanical failures, and medical emergencies, but nothing had prepared him for this. These men weren't ordinary criminals. They were too organized, too patient. The roadblock had been expertly positioned at a spot where the bus couldn't maneuver, and they had clearly been monitoring the school's field trip schedule. "What do we do?" Miss Foster whispered from where she crouched near the middle of the bus. The young teacher's face was white with terror, her hands shaking. Mrs. Hawthorne made the hardest decision of her life. The safety of 26 children outweighed everything else, including their own lives. If these men wanted hostages or ransom, she would give them whatever they demanded. If they meant harm to the children, she would fight with every breath in her body. "We do what they say," she said quietly. "For now." Morrison nodded grimly and reached for the door handle. As the bus door hissed open, the cool mountain air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and something else, the metallic smell of fear, and the indefinable odor of impending violence. One by one, they emerged from the bus. Mrs. Hawthorne first, her hands raised, her eyes scanning the forest for any sign of how many men they were facing. Morrison followed, his weathered face set in hard lines. Miss Foster came next, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Then the children, 26 young souls, stepping into a nightmare that would haunt Cedar Falls, Montana for decades to come. The masked figures emerged fully from the forest now, revealing their number 8 men, all dressed in military-style camouflage, all carrying weapons with the casual familiarity of those accustomed to violence. Their leader, a tall man with cold eyes visible through his face covering, gestured toward a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. "Start walking," he commanded. "Single file. No talking. Anyone tries to run, everyone pays the price." As the terrified group began to move toward the tray line, Rebecca Lou managed one last glance back at the yellow school bus, sitting empty on the gravel road. Sunlight streamed through the bullet hole in the windshield, creating a small rainbow on the dashboard where Frank Morrison's thermos of coffee sat forgotten. She tried to memorize every detail, some part of her 10-year-old mind understanding that this moment marked the end of everything she had known. The last thing anyone from Cedar Falls Elementary School saw of the outside world was the black pickup truck moving forward to block the road completely, its driver's face still hidden behind tinted glass, as if he were erasing the last evidence of their passage through this remote mountain wilderness. The forest swallowed them whole. Back in Cedar Falls, parents went about their normal Friday routines, unaware that their children had vanished into the Bitterroot Mountains. The first hint of trouble wouldn't come for another 6 hours, when the bus failed to return at its scheduled 3:30 p.m. arrival time. By then, the 26 students, their teachers, and their bus driver had been gone for over 5 hours, disappeared so completely that it would be as if they had never existed at all. The only witnesses to their fate were the ancient pines that had stood sentinel over these mountains for centuries, their branches whispering secrets that would remain buried in the Montana wilderness for 23 long years. Until the day a land surveyor's ground-penetrating radar detected an impossible anomaly 12 feet beneath a grove of aspen trees. Something large and metallic and very much out of place in the natural order of the forest. Something that would prove to be the burial site of Cedar Falls Elementary's missing school bus, its yellow paint still visible through 2 decades of accumulated earth, its windows dark and empty as the eye sockets of a skull. But inside that buried tomb lay evidence that would rewrite everything investigators thought they knew about the disappearance. Evidence that would suggest the 26 children, their teachers and their bus driver, hadn't died on that October morning. Evidence that would indicate they might still be alive. The first person to realize something was wrong was Margaret Caldwell, Emma's mother. At exactly 3:45 p.m. she stood in the elementary school parking lot, keys in hand, watching the empty road where the yellow bus should have appeared 15 minutes earlier. Margaret was punctual by nature, the kind of mother who arrived 10 minutes early for every pickup, every appointment, every school event. She knew Mrs. Hawthorne's reputation for timeliness, knew Frank Morrison's reliability. This wasn't like them. Other parents began arriving, their minivans and SUVs forming a loose cluster near the school's main entrance. By 4:00 p.m., 12 sets of parents stood in worried conversation, their breath visible in the cooling October air. Principal Patterson emerged from the building, her usual stern demeanor replaced by barely concealed concern. "I'm sure they are just running late," she announced to the gathering crowd, though her voice carried an uncertainty that did nothing to ease anyone's fears. These field trips sometimes take longer than expected, but privately, Patterson was already reaching for her cell phone. She had tried the bus radio 3 times in the past hour, receiving nothing but static in response. The Copper Ridge mine site had no phone service, but Morrison should have been able to reach her on the radio during the return trip once they descended below the tree line. By 4:30 p.m., the parking lot held 26 vehicles. Every parent was present, their faces showing the progression from mild annoyance to genuine worry, to the first cold touches of fear. David Torres paced beside his pickup truck, checking his watch every 30 seconds. He had given Jessica the disposable camera that morning, told her to capture every moment of her adventure. Now he found himself wondering if those images would ever be developed. Martha Winters sat in her car with the engine running, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. Her twin boys were everything to her since her husband's death 2 years earlier. Tommy and Daniel were her world, their infectious laughter the only thing that had carried her through the darkest period of her life. The thought of something happening to them was physically painful, a knife turning in her chest with every minute that passed. At 5:00 p.m., Principal Patterson made the call that would officially transform a delayed school bus into something far more sinister. Sheriff Daniel Reeves answered on the second ring, his deep voice carrying the authority of 30 years in law enforcement. "Sheriff, this is Janet Patterson at Cedar Falls Elementary. We have a situation." Reeves had been expecting the call. His office had already received 3 worried phone calls from parents in the past hour. In a town of 3,200 people, news traveled fast, and the sight of so many cars gathered at the school had not gone unnoticed. "How late are they, Janet?" "An hour and a half. Frank Morrison has never been more than 15 minutes late in all the years I've known him. And Eleanor Hawthorne." Patterson's voice trailed off. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in Cedar Falls knew Mrs. Hawthorne's reputation for responsibility. "I will dispatch 2 units to the mine road immediately," Reeves said, "and I will contact the Forest Service. If they broke down somewhere between here and there, we will find them." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Sheriff Reeves felt the familiar cold weight settling in his stomach, the same feeling he'd experienced only twice before in his career, both times when cases that had started as simple missing persons reports had ended in tragedy. The first search units rolled out of Cedar Falls at 5:15 p.m., just as the October sun was beginning to set behind the western peaks. Deputy Lisa Kane led the convoy in her patrol car, followed by a Forest Service ranger truck and the Volunteer Fire Department's rescue vehicle. The plan was simple: drive the route to Copper Ridge Mine, check for any sign of mechanical failure or accident, and establish radio contact with the missing bus. As the search vehicles climbed into the mountains, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk, Chief Raymond Walsh of the Volunteer Fire Department radioed back to town with regular updates. Mile marker 5 on Forest Service Road 42, no sign of the bus. Mile marker 10, road clear. No debris or evidence of accident. Mile marker 12. "Sheriff, this is Chief Walsh." Reeves grabbed his radio microphone. "Go ahead, Ray. We've got a situation at mile marker 12. Large tree down across the road appears to have been cut. No sign of the bus, but..." Walsh's voice carried a note of confusion. "There are fresh tire tracks in the gravel, like something heavy stopped here and then backed up. Any sign of the bus?" "Negative. But Sheriff, there's something else. We found broken glass on the road surface. Looks like it might be from a windshield." The temperature in Sheriff Reeves' office seemed to drop 10 degrees. In 30 years of law enforcement, he had learned to trust his instincts, and every instinct was now screaming that this was no simple breakdown or accident. The fallen tree, the tire tracks, the broken glass, it painted a picture of deliberate action, of an ambush carefully planned and executed. "Ray, I need you to preserve that scene exactly as you found it. Don't let anyone else drive over those tracks. I'm calling in the state police." As Chief Walsh acknowledged the order, Sheriff Reeves was already reaching for his phone. The Montana Highway Patrol had investigators trained in missing persons cases, resources that his small department lacked. But more importantly, they had experience with the kind of organized criminal activity that seemed to be emerging from the evidence on that remote mountain road. Back at the elementary school, the parents had moved inside to the cafeteria, their vehicles now forming a vigil in the darkening parking lot. Margaret Caldwell sat at one of the small plastic tables designed for children, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from her, Rebecca Lou's parents spoke in hushed Mandarin, their faces etched with the kind of worry that transcended language barriers. The school had become an unofficial command center, with Principal Patterson coordinating communication between the search teams and the families. But, as the hours passed and the radio reports brought no news of the missing bus, the atmosphere in the cafeteria grew increasingly tense. At 8:30 p.m., Sheriff Reeves arrived at the school personally, his face grim in the harsh fluorescent lighting. The conversations died away as 26 sets of parents turned toward him, their eyes reflecting the same desperate hope that he would have answers, that he would bring their children home. "Folks," Reeves began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news. "We've located where the bus stopped, about a mile from the mine entrance. We found evidence of a roadblock, a tree that had been deliberately cut down and placed across the road. We also found signs that the bus was there, but the bus itself is missing." A collective intake of breath filled the cafeteria. Margaret Caldwell felt the room tilt around her, the words hitting her like physical blows. Roadblock. Deliberately cut. Missing. "What does that mean?" David Torres demanded, his voice cracking with strain. "Are you saying someone took them?" Reeves met his gaze directly. "We are treating this as a criminal investigation. The Montana Highway Patrol is sending their best investigators, and we've contacted the FBI field office in Billings. We are going to find your children." But even as he spoke the words, Sheriff Reeves understood the magnitude of what they were facing. The Bitterroot Mountains covered thousands of square miles of rugged wilderness, much of it accessible only on foot or horseback. If someone had taken 26 children and 3 adults into that vast expanse, the search would be one of the largest in Montana's history. The investigation that followed would consume the next 6 months of his life, involving over 200 federal agents, state troopers, and volunteers. They would search caves, abandoned mining shafts, and remote cabins throughout the mountain range. They would interview known criminals, follow up on every tip and rumor, and pursue leads that stretched from Canada to Mexico. They would find nothing. The yellow school bus and its 30 passengers had vanished, as completely as if they had been erased from existence. No ransom demands ever came. No bodies were ever discovered. No witnesses ever came forward. The case that began as a delayed field trip became the largest unsolved mystery in Montana's history, a wound that never healed in the heart of Cedar Falls. Years would pass. The families would endure the special agony of not knowing, of hoping against hope that their children might still be alive somewhere, might someday come home. Search efforts would gradually diminish, then cease altogether. The case files would be transferred to cold storage, gathering dust in a basement archive where forgotten mysteries went to die. Until October 12, 2024, exactly 23 years, to the day after the disappearance, when a land surveyor named Thomas Mitchell was conducting a routine boundary survey for a proposed logging operation. His ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly in a grove of aspen trees 47 miles from where the bus had last been seen, an anomaly that proved to be a 1987 Bluebird school bus. Buried 12 feet underground, its yellow paint still visible through 2 decades of accumulated earth and decomposed vegetation. A school bus that, according to the vehicle identification number, belonged to the Cedar Falls School District. A school bus that had been reported missing on October 12th. The discovery would reopen the most notorious cold case in Montana history, bringing Sheriff Reeves, now retired but still haunted by the mystery, back to the mountains one final time. It would draw FBI investigators, forensic specialists, and media attention from around the world to the small town that had never forgotten its missing children. But most importantly, the discovery would reveal evidence inside that buried tomb that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about what had happened to the 26 students, their teachers, and their bus driver on that October morning in evidence that would suggest the victims hadn't died in those mountains, evidence that would indicate they had lived, and evidence that would prove that someone somewhere knew exactly what had happened to them and had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide the truth for more than 2 decades. The call came to retired Sheriff Daniel Reeves at 6:47 a.m. on October 12, 2024, exactly 23 years to the minute after the Cedar Falls Elementary bus had failed to return from its field trip. Reeves had been awake for hours, as he was every October 12th, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee and the weight of 26 unsolved disappearances pressing against his chest like a physical thing. "Sheriff?" The voice belonged to current Sheriff Maria Vasquez, who had taken over the department when Reeves retired 8 years earlier. "We need you out here." They found the bus. Reeves set down his coffee cup with hands that had begun to shake. In 8 years of retirement, he had never stopped hoping for this call, never stopped believing that somewhere in the vast Montana wilderness lay the answers to the questions that had haunted him every single day since. But now that the moment had arrived, he found himself almost afraid to hope. Where? 47 miles northeast of the original site, buried 12 feet down in an aspen grove. Dan Vasquez's voice carried a note he had never heard from her before, something between wonder and horror. "You need to see this yourself." The drive to the excavation site took Reeves through landscapes that had figured in his nightmares for over 2 decades. Every mile marker on Forest Service Road 402 was burned into his memory. Every turn and switchback associated with some fragment of the investigation that had consumed 6 months of his life and ultimately yielded nothing but heartbreak and failure. The media had already arrived. News vans from Billings, Helena, and even Spokane formed a small village at the Forest Service checkpoint, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like technological prayer wheels. Reporters with perfectly styled hair spoke earnestly into cameras, rehashing the basic facts of the case for audiences who had been too young to remember the original disappearance or had forgotten it in the rush of subsequent tragedies. But Reeves barely noticed the media circus. His attention was focused entirely on the heavy machinery working methodically in the grove of aspen trees. The bright yellow excavator, looking strangely appropriate as it carefully removed layers of earth from around something that shouldn't exist. A school bus buried in the middle of nowhere, 47 miles from where it had last been seen. FBI Special Agent Patricia King met Reeves at the perimeter tape. King was new to him, a sharp-featured woman in her 40s who had built her reputation on cold cases and impossible puzzles. She extended a hand that gripped his with surprising strength. "Agent King, I've read every file on this case, Sheriff. Your investigation was thorough. What happened here wasn't your fault." Reeves nodded, though the words provided little comfort. "What have you found?" King gestured toward the excavation site, where the top of the yellow bus was now fully visible, its paint faded but still recognizably, that institutional shade that marked school districts across America. "More questions than answers, I'm afraid, but the questions are disturbing." The excavator had exposed the entire roof and upper sides of the bus. From this angle, it looked almost like it was surfacing from underground water, some mechanical submarine breaching after decades in the depths. Crime scene photographers moved around the perimeter, documenting every angle, every detail that might prove significant. "How long has it been down there?" Reeves asked. "Preliminary soil analysis suggests the burial happened within 6 months of the disappearance. But here's what doesn't make sense. The burial was professional. Whoever did this had heavy equipment, expertise, and time. This wasn't a panicked criminal trying to hide evidence. This was deliberate, methodical, and expensive. Reeves studied the excavation with the eye of someone who had spent 3 decades analyzing crime scenes. The walls of the pit were perfectly vertical, cut with the precision of professional earth-moving equipment. The bus itself sat level, as if it had been carefully positioned before burial. This level of organization suggested resources far beyond what he had imagined during the original investigation. "Have you been inside?" Agent King's expression darkened. "That's why we need you here. What we found inside changes everything about this case." The descent into the excavation pit required a ladder and safety harness. At 74, Reeves was no longer the agile lawman who had scrambled through mountain terrain during the original search, but his determination to finally see inside that bus overcame any physical limitations. Agent King led the way, their boots landing with hollow thuds on the metal roof. The emergency exit hatch had been carefully cut open by FBI technicians, creating a neat rectangular opening that allowed access to the bus's interior. Portable work lights had been rigged throughout the vehicle, casting harsh shadows that turned the familiar yellow seats into a landscape of light and darkness. Reeves lowered himself through the hatch and immediately understood why Agent King had summoned him. This wasn't the interior of a bus that had been abandoned in panic 23 years earlier. This was something else entirely. Every seat had been modified. The standard school bus seating had been removed and replaced with what could only be described as sleeping berths, narrow platforms with thin mattresses, each equipped with restraints that had been carefully disguised to look like safety belts. Beneath each berth was a small storage compartment containing personal items that made Reeves's blood run cold. Agent King handed him an evidence bag containing a small plastic toy, a miniature horse with a purple mane that he recognized immediately. Emma Caldwell had carried it everywhere, her constant companion since her 5th birthday. Her mother had mentioned it dozens of times during the original investigation. "We found personal items belonging to all 26 children," King said quietly. "Clothes, toys, books, jewelry. Things they would have had with them on the day they disappeared." Reeves moved slowly through the bus, his flashlight beam revealing detail after terrible detail. The windows had been covered from the inside with metal plates welded seamlessly into place, creating a sealed environment. Ventilation shafts had been installed along the ceiling, connected to a complex air filtration system that suggested the bus had been designed for long-term habitation. Near the front of the bus, where Mrs. Hawthorne would have sat, Reeves found something that made his hands tremble. A small journal bound in leather, with Eleanor written on the cover in the familiar handwriting he remembered from report cards and parent conferences. "Have you read it?" he asked Agent King. "Parts of it." "Sheriff, what's in that journal suggests these people were alive for months after the disappearance, possibly years." Reeves opened the journal with the careful reverence of someone handling ancient scripture. The first entry was dated October 13th, 2001, the day after the disappearance. "Day 1. The children are scared but unharmed. They tell us we are being moved to a facility where we will be processed. I don't understand what that means, but I'm trying to keep everyone calm. Michael O'Brien made jokes during breakfast to cheer up the younger ones. Rebecca Lou has been helping me organize activities to keep their minds occupied. If anyone ever reads this, know that we are alive and we are fighting to come home." Agent King watched Reeves's face as he read. "It goes on for over 2 years, Sheriff. Detailed accounts of their captivity, descriptions of their captors, records of everything they experienced. Mrs. Hawthorne never stopped being a teacher, even in whatever this was." Reeves flipped through pages filled with lesson plans adapted for their imprisonment, behavioral notes about how each child was coping, and increasingly desperate attempts to document their situation for future investigators. The handwriting gradually changed from Miss Hawthorne's neat cursive to different styles, other adults taking over the record-keeping as circumstances changed.
On 2027.
Amanda Foster took over today's entry. Eleanor has been moved to a different section. We haven't seen her in 3 days. The children keep asking where she is. I don't know what to tell them. Frank Morrison tried to escape last night. They brought him back this morning, but he's changed. They are doing something to people here, something that changes them. Day 23. This is Frank Morrison, writing. I know how this looks, but I'm still me. They offered me a choice: stay a prisoner or join them as a guard. I chose to stay alive so I could protect the kids. Eleanor is gone. They said she was reassigned. I think I know what that means, and it makes me sick. But I can keep watching over these children if I cooperate. God forgive me for what I'm about to become. The entries became more sporadic after that, written in different hands, documenting a gradual transformation from rescue hope to survival acceptance to something darker: adaptation. The later entries spoke of children being selected for special programs, of families being promised reunification if they cooperated fully, of a complex organization that seemed to operate facilities across multiple states. Day 41, Rebecca Lou, writing. I'm 14 now, or I think I am. We don't get much news from outside. They let me take over record keeping because my handwriting is neat and I remember details. Mrs. Foster left last month for advanced placement. Same thing they said about Mrs. Hawthorne. Tommy and Daniel Winters were selected for the Montana facility. Their specialty program, they called it. We haven't seen them since.
Day 57 to 8. Still Rebecca.
Jessica Torres and Emma Caldwell were moved to the California operation last week. They said it was a reward for good behavior, that they'd be with families again. I hope that's true. I hope this journal finds someone who can track them down. The children who are left there, only 11 of us now. We don't talk about the ones who've been moved. It hurts too much to hope. Reeves had to stop reading. The clinical detachment with which these horrors were documented made them somehow worse than emotional outpouring would have been. These were teachers and children forced to witness their family unit being systematically dismantled, documenting their own destruction with the thoroughness of scientists studying their own extinction. How many entries are there? He asked. Over 700. The last one is dated March 15, 2004. Nearly 2.5 years after the disappearance. Agent King led him to the back of the bus, where the final entries had been found. Here, the modifications were even more extensive. What had once been the emergency exit area had been converted into a workshop where detailed maps and documents were stored in waterproof containers. The maps showed facilities across the western United States: Montana, Idaho, Oregon, California, Nevada. Each location was marked with numbers that corresponded to coded entries in separate ledgers. The documentation was exhaustive, suggesting an organization that operated on a massive scale, moving people between facilities like inventory in a warehouse system. Sheriff, we are looking at something that goes far beyond a local kidnapping. This appears to be evidence of a systematic operation that has been running for decades, possibly since the 19th. Reeves studied a map of Montana that showed 7 marked locations, including one labeled Primary Processing Cedar Falls Acquisition, and another marked Long-Term Housing Bitterroot Complex. The level of detail was staggering: facility capacities, transportation routes, personnel assignments, and what appeared to be financial records tracking operational costs and revenue streams. Revenue streams. As if human beings were a commodity to be harvested and sold. Day 701. This is Rebecca Lou's final entry. I'm 18 today. Old enough to understand what this really is. They've been selling us, not for ransom, not for labor, selling us to people who want children, who want families, who want to own human beings without the complications of legal adoption or legitimate family structures. We aren't prisoners anymore. We are products. They are moving me tomorrow to something they call final placement. I've hidden copies of our documentation throughout this bus. If anyone ever finds this, please know that we tried to resist, tried to escape, tried to stay together as a family. But they separated us, broke us down, rebuilt us into what their customers wanted. The children who were taken early, Emma, Jessica, the Winters twins, they are probably alive somewhere, living with people who think they are providing homes for orphans. They won't remember Cedar Falls, won't remember their real families. The integration process takes about 2 years. They told us, chemical assistance combined with psychological conditioning, complete identity reconstruction. I remember everything because I fought the process. I remember Mrs. Hawthorne trying to shield us from the worst of it. I remember Mr. Morrison's last desperate attempt to get word to the outside world. I remember every child's face, every laugh, every tear. I remember who we were before they tried to turn us into merchandise. If you are reading this, please find them. Please bring them home. The final entry was followed by detailed descriptions of the children, their new identities as provided by their captors, and the last known locations where they had been sent. It was a love letter written by a teenager to families she would never see again, a promise that someone somewhere would remember the truth. Agent King handed Reeves another evidence bag, this one containing a small metal object that gleamed dully in the work lights. She wasn't just documenting, Sheriff. She was planning. The object was a key, crudely carved from a piece of scavenged metal. Attached to it was a note in Rebecca's handwriting. Emergency exit, rear panel behind false wall. Map to Montana facility. GPS coordinates for transport routes. Evidence of full operation stored in hidden compartment. It took another 6 hours of careful excavation to locate the hidden compartment Rebecca had referenced. Behind what appeared to be a solid wall panel, investigators found a waterproof case containing the most comprehensive intelligence archive on human trafficking that the FBI had ever discovered. The documents detailed an organization that called itself the Relocation Network, a systematic operation that had been acquiring and relocating people for over 30 years. Their methodology was sophisticated. Target isolated groups in remote locations, stage disappearances that would be difficult to investigate, process the victims through a network of hidden facilities, and ultimately place them with clients who paid enormous sums for untraceable family acquisitions. The Cedar Falls disappearance hadn't been a random crime. It had been a carefully planned harvest operation, targeting a specific group of children based on detailed profiles of their backgrounds, family situations, and psychological assessments. The organization had spent months studying the school's field trip patterns, identifying the optimal location for an acquisition that would leave minimal evidence and maximum confusion. But Rebecca Lou had been an unexpected variable. Her intelligence, her determination to document everything, and her refusal to surrender her identity had created a comprehensive record of the operation's inner workings. Hidden in the buried bus was evidence of hundreds of similar acquisitions dating back to 1983. Missing persons cases that had never been solved, children who had vanished without a trace. As darkness fell over the excavation site, Reeves found himself sitting on the edge of the pit, staring down at the yellow bus that contained both answers and new nightmares. 23 years of wondering what had happened to those children, and now he knew. They had been commodified, processed, and sold like livestock to people wealthy enough to buy human beings. But Rebecca's documentation suggested something else, something that made his heart pound with possibilities he had never dared consider. Many of them might still be alive. Agent King approached, carrying a thick folder of photocopied documents. "Sheriff, we need to talk about next steps. This evidence points to active operations in multiple states. If even half of what's documented here is accurate, we are looking at the largest human trafficking investigation in US history." Reeves nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead to the implications. Somewhere in the western United States, children who had once laughed and played in Cedar Falls Elementary might now be adults living under assumed identities, possibly unaware of their true origins. Emma Caldwell might be a mother herself, raising children who would never know their grandmother. Margaret had spent 23 years hoping for their return. The Winters twins might be living separate lives, never knowing they had once been inseparable brothers. How do we find them? We start with the facilities identified in the documents. The Montana complex appears to still be operational. We have coordinates, personnel records, and financial documentation. If we can take down one facility, we might be able to trace the entire network. As Agent King spoke, crime scene technicians continued their methodical documentation of the bus interior. Each piece of evidence was photographed, catalogued, and prepared for analysis. The personal items belonging to 26 children were carefully preserved, 23-year-old artifacts of interrupted lives that might finally lead their owners home. But even as hope began to kindle in Reeves's chest for the first time in over 2 decades, he understood that this discovery had opened a door to horrors far beyond what anyone had imagined. The Cedar Falls disappearance hadn't been an isolated tragedy. It had been one small part of a systematic operation that had been destroying families for 30 years. Tomorrow, the real investigation would begin. FBI task forces would coordinate raids on multiple facilities. Missing persons databases would be cross-referenced with the documentation found in the buried bus. Families across the country would receive phone calls about cases they had long since given up hope of solving. But tonight, as Reeves drove home through the Montana darkness, he carried with him the weight of Rebecca Lou's final plea. Please find them, please bring them home. 23 years after the children of Cedar Falls had vanished into the mountains, the search was finally beginning. And this time, they had a map. The only question now was whether the trail Rebecca had so carefully preserved would lead to joyful reunions or to discoveries too terrible to imagine. Because buried in those documents was one final chilling detail that Agent King had not yet shared with anyone. The Relocation Network's records showed that the Cedar Falls acquisition had been classified as a test operation, a pilot program for something they called Project Generational Transfer. A program designed not just to relocate children, but to create entirely new family lineages, erasing bloodlines and rewriting human history one stolen life at a time. And according to the documents found in Rebecca Lou's hidden cache, Project Generational Transfer was scheduled to enter its final phase in the winter of 3 months from now. The pre-dawn darkness of November 3rd, 2024, was shattered by the coordinated movement of federal agents across 7 states. Operation Cedar Falls, named for the 26 children whose disappearance had led to this moment, was the largest simultaneous raid in FBI history, targeting 12 facilities identified through Rebecca Lou's meticulously preserved documentation. Special Agent Patricia King stood in the command center, established in a converted aircraft hangar outside Missoula, Montana, watching multiple screens display real-time feeds from tactical teams positioned around the primary target, a compound hidden in the Bitterroot Mountains, 43 miles from where the school bus had been discovered. The facility was larger than satellite imagery had suggested, a sprawling complex of buildings disguised as a corporate retreat center, complete with recreational facilities and administrative offices that masked its true purpose. "All teams report ready," came the voice of the tactical commander through her headset. "Target acquired. Multiple structures. Estimated 40 to 60 individuals on site." King glanced at the digital clock on the wall. 4:47 a.m. In 13 minutes, teams across the western United States would simultaneously breach facilities in Montana, Idaho, Oregon, California, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. The timing was critical. The Relocation Network's own documents had revealed a sophisticated communication system that could trigger rapid facility evacuations if any single location was compromised. Beside King, retired Sheriff Daniel Reeves sat motionless, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair. At 74, he had no official role in the operation, but Agent King had insisted he be present. This was his case, his decades-long quest for answers, and he deserved to witness whatever resolution the dawn might bring. "Montana team, you are go." The words echoed across the command center as night vision cameras captured the movement of federal agents through the pre-dawn darkness. The primary facility was built into a natural bowl in the mountains, surrounded by dense forest that had concealed its existence for over 2 decades. As tactical teams approached the perimeter, motion sensors triggered floodlights that illuminated a complex far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. The main building was a converted lodge, its rustic exterior hiding reinforced walls and sophisticated security systems. Surrounding it were smaller structures that Rebecca's documents had identified as processing centers, long-term housing, and most ominously, integration facilities buildings, where stolen identities were systematically erased and replaced with manufactured histories. Breaching main structure, the tactical commander reported. Multiple subjects in custody, no resistance. The feeds from the agents' helmet cameras revealed a surreal scene inside the lodge. What appeared to be a normal conference room was lined with detailed organizational charts, showing the network's operations across the country. Maps covered the walls, marked with acquisition sites, processing timelines, and placement destinations. It was a corporate headquarters managing human beings as inventory. Agent King watched the screens with growing amazement and horror. The scale of the operation exceeded even Rebecca's most disturbing documentation. This wasn't just a trafficking network. It was a systematic program to reshape American demographics, selectively acquiring specific types of families and redistributing them according to some incomprehensible master plan. Agent King, the tactical commander's voice carried a note of urgency. "You need to see this, we've found them." The camera feed shifted to a different building, one that Rebecca's notes had identified as alumni housing. Inside, federal agents had discovered a residential facility housing 37 adults, ranging in age from mid-20s to early 40s. They lived in comfortable apartments, had jobs within the complex, and appeared to function as a self-contained community. But their faces told a different story. King recognized them immediately from the missing persons file she had memorized over the past 3 weeks. The bone structure was the same, the basic features unchanged by the passage of years. These were the children who had been processed by the Relocation network over the past 3 decades, adults who had been systematically stripped of their original identities and rebuilt as components of an artificial community. "My God," Reeves whispered, leaning forward in his chair. "That's Tommy Winters." On the screen, a 33-year-old man sat on a couch in what appeared to be a comfortable living room, calmly answering questions from an FBI agent. His hair was darker than Reeves remembered, his face marked by the years, but the underlying features were unmistakably those of the mischievous 10-year-old who had climbed aboard the Cedar Falls school bus 23 years earlier. The man called himself Thomas Warren. He worked as a maintenance supervisor for the facility. He had no memory of Cedar Falls, Montana, or of ever having a twin brother named Daniel. When shown photographs of his original family, he displayed polite confusion, as if being asked to recognize complete strangers. "Integration successful," King read from Rebecca's documentation. "Subject displays no recognition of pre-acquisition identity. Psychological conditioning complete. Ready for external placement or facility retention, as needed." The cameras revealed more familiar faces among the residents. A woman who might have been Jessica Torres worked in the facility's kitchen, calling herself Jennifer Walsh. A man who resembled Michael O'Brien maintained the complex's computer systems under the name Martin Oliver. They moved through their daily routines with the efficient contentment of people who had never known any other life. But it was the next discovery that made Reeves grip the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. "Agent King, we've got something in Building 7. You are going to want to see this immediately." The camera feed switched to a different structure, this one clearly designed as living quarters for children. Federal agents moved through dormitory-style rooms filled with bunk beds, each space personalized with toys, books, and artwork that would have seemed normal in any other context. But the children living here, 43 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 16, were not normal children. They were acquisitions, recent ones, based on the missing persons alerts that had been circulating through law enforcement channels over the past year. Children who had vanished from camping trips, school outings, and family vacations across the western states. The Relocation network was still actively operating, still harvesting new victims to feed its systematic destruction of human identity. Among the children, federal agents found something that made Agent King's blood run cold. A 10-year-old girl with auburn hair and green eyes, who looked exactly like the photographs of Emma Caldwell at the same age. Not Emma herself, she would be 33 now, but a child who could have been her daughter, bearing such a striking resemblance that the genetic connection was unmistakable. Jesus Christ, King breathed. They are breeding them. The implications hit her like a physical blow. The Relocation network hadn't just been trafficking individuals, they had been creating multi-generational family units, pairing their processed adults and raising their children within the system from birth. Project Generational Transfer wasn't just about erasing existing identities, it was about creating entirely new bloodlines, severed from their genetic histories and raised according to the network's specifications. All teams, priority search for documentation, King commanded into her headset. We need to find their breeding records, their placement lists, everything. As federal agents secured the Montana facility, similar operations unfolded across the western United States. The Oregon compound yielded 31 adults and 19 children. The California facility contained 45 adults, 27 children, and most disturbingly a maternity ward, where 6 women were in various stages of pregnancy. The Nevada operation revealed a specialized facility focused entirely on what their documentation called genetic optimization, the systematic pairing of processed adults based on desired physical and intellectual characteristics. But it was the discovery in Idaho that provided the most chilling revelation about the true scope of Project Generational Transfer. Hidden in an underground bunker beneath the main facility, federal agents found a computer system containing records dating back to the Relocation network hadn't been operating for 30 years. It had been functioning for over 50 years, systematically acquiring and redistributing human beings across multiple generations. The database contained over 14,000 individual records, missing persons cases that had never been solved, families that had vanished without a trace, children who had disappeared from playgrounds and schools across America. Each entry included acquisition details, processing timelines, placement records, and in many cases, breeding assignments that extended into the second and third generations. Margaret Caldwell's phone rang at 6:23 a.m. Mountain Time. She had been awake since 4:30 a.m., as she was every morning, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had grown cold hours earlier. 23 years of sleepless nights had conditioned her body to function on minimal rest, her maternal instincts refusing to fully relax even when logic told her that her daughter was gone forever. Mrs. Caldwell, this is Special Agent Patricia King with the FBI. Ma'am, we need you to sit down. Margaret was already sitting, but she gripped the edge of the table anyway, her knuckles whitening as Agent King's words penetrated the fog of cautious hope that had surrounded her since the discovery of the buried bus. We've found your daughter. The words seemed to echo in the kitchen, bouncing off the refrigerator where Emma's 4th grade school picture still hung after 23 years, surrounded by dozens of missing person flyers that Margaret had never been able to bring herself to remove. She's alive, Mrs. Caldwell. Emma is alive. But even as Agent King spoke the words that Margaret had prayed to hear for over 2 decades, the FBI agent was struggling with how to explain the complexity of what they had actually discovered. Emma Caldwell was alive, but she was no longer Emma Caldwell. She was a 33-year-old woman named Ellen Carter, who lived in a comfortable apartment in Bend, Oregon, working as a nurse at a local hospital, married to a man she had met through what she believed was a normal dating process, but which was actually a carefully orchestrated introduction to another processed individual. Ellen Carter had no memory of Cedar Falls, Montana. She had no memory of Margaret Caldwell, Her earliest memories were of growing up in the Oregon facility, believing herself to be an orphan who had been rescued and raised by a benevolent organization that provided education, career training, and eventual placement in the outside world. She had given birth to 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son who carried the genetic legacy of Cedar Falls in their auburn hair and green eyes, but who would grow up never knowing their true grandmother lived just 700 miles away, had never stopped searching for them, had never stopped hoping for their return. Mrs. Caldwell, Agent King continued gently, "There are some complexities to Emma's situation that we need to discuss in person. Can someone drive you to the federal building in Billings? We have counselors standing by, and we are going to need your help in determining the best way to approach this." Margaret Caldwell set down the phone and stared at her daughter's photograph on the refrigerator. Emma was alive. After 23 years of wondering, worrying, and grieving, her little girl was alive. But something in Agent King's tone suggested that the reunion she had dreamed of might be more complicated than simply holding her daughter again. Across Cedar Falls, similar phone calls were being made to families who had never stopped hoping. Martha Winters learned that her twin sons were alive, but living as separate individuals who believed themselves to be unrelated men with different names, different histories, and no memory of ever being brothers. David Torres was told that his daughter Jessica lived in California, had become a teacher like Mrs. Hawthorne, and had spent her adult life unknowingly passing on the very nurturing spirit that had made her mother proud 23 years earlier. But for every joyful call there was devastating news. Mrs. Hawthorne had died in the facility in 2003, according to records found in the Montana compound. Frank Morrison had suffered a psychological breakdown during his integration process and had been transferred to what the documents euphemistically called permanent care. Amanda Foster had been reassigned to a different facility and had died during a medical procedure. The scope of the tragedy extended far beyond Cedar Falls. The database contained records of thousands of families torn apart over 5 decades, children raised in artificial communities, adults living lives built on manufactured memories. The Relocation network had systematically rewritten the American family structure, creating a shadow population of processed individuals who had been severed from their genetic and cultural heritage. Rebecca Liu was found in the California facility, now 33 years old, and working as a data analyst under the name Rachel Lewis. Unlike many of the other processed individuals, she had retained fragments of her original memories, possibly due to her teenage resistance to the integration process. When federal agents showed her the journal she had hidden in the buried bus, tears streamed down her face as 23 years of carefully suppressed memories came flooding back. "I remember," she whispered, holding the journal with trembling hands. "I remember everything." Rebecca became the key to understanding the full scope of Project Generational Transfer. Her analytical mind, the same intelligence that had documented their original captivity, now helped federal investigators decode the complex systems that had operated for over 5 decades. She identified breeding programs, placement networks, and financial structures that had funneled billions of dollars through legitimate businesses that served as fronts for human trafficking operations. But the most chilling discovery came when Rebecca analyzed the timeline documents found in the Idaho facility. Project Generational Transfer's final phase wasn't scheduled for December 2024, as originally thought. It had already begun. The network had been systematically placing their processed adults in positions of influence across American society: teachers, social workers, adoption specialists, child protective services personnel, and family court judges. These individuals, raised from childhood to serve the network's interests, were now in positions to facilitate the legal acquisition of children through the very systems designed to protect them. The Cedar Falls disappearance hadn't been an isolated crime or even the beginning of a criminal enterprise. It had been a test case for the systematic infiltration and eventual replacement of American family structures. The network had spent 50 years perfecting their methods, and they were now ready to transition from covert operations to semi-legitimate acquisition through corrupted legal systems. They are not just stealing children anymore, Rebecca explained to the federal task force assembled in the Zulu Command Center. They are rewriting the legal definition of family. They have people in positions to declare parents unfit, to facilitate adoptions, to place children in therapeutic facilities that are actually processing centers. They've built a pipeline that makes kidnapping unnecessary. The raids had disrupted 12 facilities, but Rebecca's analysis of the recovered databases suggested that the network operated at least 47 locations across North America. They had processed an estimated 14,000 individuals over 5 decades, creating a shadow population of processed adults and their genetically connected children who had no knowledge of their true origins. The investigation that followed Operation Cedar Falls would consume the next 3 years of federal law enforcement efforts. Processed individuals were identified through DNA testing and slowly, carefully reunited with families who had never stopped searching for them. Some, like Rebecca, retained enough original memory to facilitate genuine reconnection. Others, like Tommy Winters, required extensive psychological counseling to even understand that their entire life history had been artificially constructed. The children found in the facilities presented the most complex challenges. Many had been born into the system and had no genetic families to return to. Others had been recently acquired and could be reunited with their original families, but required extensive therapy to process the trauma of their experiences. Emma Caldwell, now Ellen Carter, met her mother, Margaret, on a cold December morning in 2024, 6 weeks after the raids. The reunion took place in a carefully controlled environment at the FBI field office in Billings, with psychologists and counselors standing by to help navigate the complex emotions of a relationship that had been severed for 23 years. Margaret had aged dramatically in the weeks since learning of her daughter's survival. The stress of preparing for a reunion with a daughter who didn't remember her had taken a physical toll, but nothing could diminish the fierce love that had sustained her through more than 2 decades of uncertainty. Ellen Carter looked exactly as Margaret had imagined her daughter would look at 33, the same green eyes, the same stubborn set to her chin, the same unconscious habit of tucking her hair behind her left ear when nervous. But when Ellen looked at Margaret, there was no recognition, no spark of connection, just the polite attention of someone meeting a stranger who claimed to be significant in her life. "I'm sorry," Ellen said softly, her voice carrying the same musical quality that Margaret remembered from bedtime songs 23 years earlier. "I wish I could remember you. They tell me you are my mother, and I can see the resemblance in the photographs," but she trailed off, her eyes filled with confusion and guilt. Margaret reached across the table, separating them, her hand hovering just above Ellen's until her daughter, this woman who was her daughter, nodded permission for contact. The touch was electric, a physical connection that transcended memory and history. "It's okay, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, using the endearment she had repeated every night for 23 years in prayers for Emma's safe return. "We have time. We have all the time in the world to get to know each other again." The legal and emotional challenges of reuniting the Cedar Falls survivors with their original families would prove more complex than anyone had anticipated. Some processed individuals, like Rebecca Lou, gradually recovered fragments of their original memories and were able to build relationships with their genetic families. Others remained permanently severed from their past, their integration so complete that attempts to restore original memories caused severe psychological distress. The network's breeding programs had created additional complications. Children who had been born and raised in the facilities had no legal families to return to, but their genetic heritage connected them to grandparents, aunts, and uncles who had never known they existed. Courts struggled with custody decisions involving children whose entire existence had been the product of systematic human trafficking. The financial infrastructure that had supported the Relocation network for 5 decades proved to be embedded throughout legitimate American business. Front companies, shell corporations, and corrupted non-profit organizations had funneled billions of dollars through mainstream financial systems. The investigation revealed that some of America's most respected adoption agencies, charitable foundations, and child welfare organizations had been unknowingly facilitating the network's operations for decades. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was the extent to which processed individuals had been placed in positions of authority within the systems designed to protect children. Teachers, social workers, judges, and law enforcement personnel who had been raised from childhood to serve the network's interests were now in positions to perpetuate the cycle of systematic family destruction. The final report on Operation Cedar Falls, released 18 months after the raids, concluded that the Relocation network had successfully infiltrated American society to a degree that made complete eradication impossible. While the major processing facilities had been shut down and the leadership arrested, the network's 50-year operation had created a generational legacy that would take decades to fully understand and address. Rebecca Liu, now working as a consultant with the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force, estimated that there were between 8,000 and 12,000 processed individuals living in American society with no knowledge of their true origins. Many had established families of their own, creating a third generation of genetically connected individuals who might never know their true heritage. On October 12, 2025, exactly 24 years after the Cedar Falls disappearance, a memorial service was held for Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne, Frank Morrison, and Amanda Foster, the three adults who had died during their captivity but whose sacrifice had helped preserve the evidence that ultimately brought down the Relocation network. The service was held in the Cedar Falls Elementary School gymnasium, the same building where parents had gathered in desperate hope on that terrible October evening. But this time the gathering included not only the original families but also the survivors who had been returned to them. Rebecca Liu, Ellen Carter, Thomas Warren, and the dozen other processed adults who had been successfully identified and reunited with their genetic families. Margaret Caldwell sat in the front row, her arm around her daughter Ellen, who had slowly begun to recover fragments of memories from her childhood in Cedar Falls. The process was gradual and sometimes painful, but with each recovered memory came a strengthening of the bond between mother and daughter that had survived 23 years of separation. Beside them sat Ellen's three children, Margaret's grandchildren, who were slowly learning about the grandmother they had never known existed, and the family history that had been stolen from them before their birth. The oldest, a 12-year-old girl named Grace, had inherited Emma's auburn hair and her talent for drawing, creating artwork that helped the family navigate the complex emotions of their reunification. Sheriff Daniel Reeves, now 75 and moving slowly with the aid of a walker, rose to address the gathering. His voice carried the weight of decades spent searching for answers, but also the satisfaction of a man who had finally brought his most important case to resolution. 24 years ago we failed these children, Reeves began, his words echoing in the gymnasium where 4 generations of Cedar Falls families had gathered for school events, basketball games, and community celebrations. We failed their teachers, we failed their families. We had the resources, the determination, and the love, but we didn't have the knowledge to understand what we were really fighting. He paused, looking out at the faces in the audience, some familiar from decades of shared grief, others new faces of survivors who had been returned to their community after a generation in exile. What we've learned from Rebecca's courage, from Eleanor's documentation, from the sacrifice of everyone who was taken that day, is that evil sometimes operates on a scale beyond our imagination. The people who took our children didn't just want to harm a few families in a small Montana town. They wanted to reshape the very nature of family, to rewrite the connections that bind us together, to turn human love into a commodity to be bought and sold. Reeves's voice grew stronger as he continued. But they underestimated something fundamental about the human spirit. They underestimated a teacher's dedication to her students. They underestimated a teenager's determination to preserve the truth. They underestimated a community's refusal to forget, and they underestimated the power of love to survive even when memory fails. As the memorial service concluded, the survivors gathered outside the school where their journey had begun 24 years earlier. Some carried new memories layered over old ones. Others struggled with the disconnect between their processed lives and their genetic heritage. But all of them shared the bond of having survived an experience that had fundamentally altered their understanding of family, identity, and human connection. Ellen Carter stood with her mother Margaret, watching her children play on the same playground where she had played as Emma Caldwell over 2 decades earlier. The memories were still fragmentary, still painful to access, but they were returning slowly, like photographs developing in a dark room. "Do you think we will ever know all of them?" Ellen asked, referring to the thousands of processed individuals who remained unidentified across the country. All the people who are living lives they don't realize were stolen from them. Margaret considered the question, watching her granddaughter Grace climb the same monkey bars that Emma had mastered as a 4th grader. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I know that everyone we find, every family we reunite, is a victory against the people who tried to erase love from the world." Rebecca Lou joined them at the fence surrounding the playground. Her own children, genetic children born after her rescue, running alongside Ellen's kids in the kind of natural friendship that transcends the complexities of their families' histories. "The investigation will continue," Rebecca said quietly. "There are still facilities out there, still processed individuals who don't know their true stories. But we've broken the back of their operation. Project Generational Transfer is finished." As the sun set over Cedar Falls, Montana, casting long shadows across the elementary school playground, the survivors of the October 12th disappearance began the long journey toward healing. They had been taken as children, processed as products, and returned as adults. But the fundamental connections that made them family, the love that had sustained their original families through 23 years of uncertainty, the bonds that had helped them survive their captivity, and the determination that had preserved the evidence necessary to bring them home, had proven stronger than any system designed to erase them. The yellow school bus remained in FBI storage, its interior preserved as evidence for the ongoing prosecutions of Relocation Network personnel. But the children who had once ridden that bus to their fate had found their way home through paths no one could have imagined, carrying with them the proof that human love, human connection, and human determination could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy them. In the end, the story of the Cedar Falls disappearance became not just a tale of survival, but a testament to the unbreakable bonds that define family, bonds that transcend memory, time, and even the most deliberate attempts to sever them. The children who had vanished into the Montana wilderness had returned as adults, forever changed but fundamentally unbroken, carrying within them the enduring truth that love, once given, can never truly be taken away.